I'm Lieutenant Commander Alexandra Henderson, 34, a Navy officer who worked her way up from the bottom through discipline and grit. For years, I carried my family, financially, emotionally, and practically always the one they could call when something needed fixing. But on my wedding day, when I overheard my cousin sneer, "She's a joke," and others laugh at my dress, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been mocked or dismissed by the very people you sacrificed the most for? If so, share your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I dive into what happened, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being torn down, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and self-respect. What happened next might surprise you. Growing up in the Henderson family meant learning early that love came with conditions. My mother had a way of sighing when I walked into rooms, like my presence was somehow disappointing before I'd even spoken. My father buried himself in work, emerging only to referee the latest family drama or deliver lectures about responsibility. My siblings learned to navigate this landscape by finding their niches. Sarah became the achiever, Mark the charmer, and I became the reliable one. Being reliable in my family meant showing up when others wouldn't. When my grandmother needed someone to drive her to doctor's appointments, I rearranged my schedule. When my parents' furnace died in February, I covered the emergency repair costs without being asked. When my cousin's wedding needed last-minute catering help, I spent my weekend cooking for 200 guests I barely knew. The pattern established itself over decades. Holiday gatherings meant I'd arrive early to help set up and stay late to clean. Family emergencies meant my phone would ring first. Financial crises somehow became my responsibility to solve. I told myself this was what families did for each other, but the reciprocal gestures never materialized. My mother would introduce me at social gatherings with a practiced smile that never reached her eyes. "This is my daughter, the Navy officer," she'd say, the words carrying an undertone I could never quite decipher. Not pride, exactly. More like resigned acknowledgement that I'd chosen something she couldn't understand or relate to. My siblings had different relationships with our parents. Sarah's medical degree earned approving nods. Mark's sales career generated animated conversations about his latest deals. My military service seemed to puzzle them, as if I'd deliberately chosen something foreign to make a point they couldn't grasp. The criticism was never direct enough to confront, but constant enough to erode. Comments about my haircut being too severe for a woman. Observations that military life must be lonely. Questions about when I'd settle down and have a real family, delivered with the implication that my chosen family of fellow service members somehow didn't count. I learned to deflect these moments with humor or redirect conversations to safer topics. But each gathering left me feeling slightly hollowed out, like I was slowly disappearing even as I stood right there among them. The irony wasn't lost on me that the people who knew me longest seemed to understand me least. When I started dating James, a fellow officer I'd met during joint training exercises, I expected the usual polite disinterest from my family. Instead, I found something worse, barely concealed condescension. They asked questions that sounded supportive but carried sharp edges. Was he planning to make a career of the military? Did we think we'd be able to maintain a stable relationship with all that moving around? Wouldn't it be difficult to raise children in that environment? James noticed it before I fully acknowledged it. After our first family dinner together, he was quiet during the drive home. Finally, he said, "They don't see you the way I do." I asked what he meant. "They treat you like you're still the kid who needed their approval. But you're not that person anymore." He was right. Somewhere along the way, while I was busy being reliable and accommodating, I'd grown into someone they no longer recognized. The competent officer who led teams and made life-or-death decisions seemed to vanish the moment I walked into my childhood home. I became the daughter again, seeking approval that would never come in the form I needed. The engagement should have been a turning point. When James proposed during a quiet weekend at the beach, I felt something shift inside me. This was my chance to build something different, something based on mutual respect and genuine partnership. I called my mother first, hoping to share that excitement. Her response was lukewarm congratulations, followed by immediate concerns about timing, location, and guest lists. She worried about the expense. She questioned whether I was sure about marrying someone in the military. She suggested waiting until James got stationed somewhere more convenient for the family. Each conversation about wedding plans became an exercise in defending choices I should have been celebrated for making. My dress wasn't formal enough, then too formal. The venue was too small, then unnecessarily expensive. The guest list didn't include enough distant relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. I found myself making compromises I didn't want to make, trying to balance my vision with their expectations. But nothing I did seemed to satisfy them. The harder I worked to include them in the process, the more critical they became. It was like they'd decided the wedding was somehow about them, and I was failing to deliver the event they'd imagined. The breaking point came during a dress fitting 3 weeks before the ceremony. My mother, sister, and 2 cousins had come along for what I hoped would be a bonding experience. Instead, I stood on the platform while they dissected every detail of my appearance. The dress was too simple, according to my mother. My sister thought the neckline was unflattering. My cousin suggested I might want to consider something more traditional, more appropriate for my age. Each comment felt like a small cut, precise and deliberate. I looked at myself in the mirror, trying to see what they saw. The woman staring back looked confident and happy, dressed in exactly the style that felt right for her. But their voices created doubt where none had existed before. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was kidding myself about what suited me. That night, I called James from my hotel room and cried for the first time in months. Not the quiet tears I'd learned to shed privately, but the exhausted sobs of someone who'd been holding too much for too long. He listened without trying to fix anything, which somehow made it worse and better simultaneously. "You don't need their permission to be happy," he said finally. "You already earned that right." His words settled something in me. I'd been so focused on winning their approval that I'd forgotten I didn't actually need it. The wedding was about James and me, about the life we were choosing to build together. Everyone else was simply invited to witness that choice. I called my mother the next morning and told her I appreciated her input, but the decisions were made. The dress, the venue, the guest list, everything would remain as planned. She was quiet for a long moment before saying she hoped I knew what I was doing. I told her I did. For the first time in years, I felt like myself again. Planning the wedding became an exercise in boundaries I should have drawn decades earlier. When relatives called with suggestions that sounded more like demands, I listened politely and thanked them for their concern. When my mother tried to invite additional guests without consulting me, I gently but firmly reminded her that James and I were handling the arrangements. The pushback was immediate and predictable. I was being unreasonable, they said. Ungrateful. Selfish. These accusations might have devastated me a year earlier, but something had shifted. I was marrying a man who saw my worth clearly, surrounded by colleagues who respected my judgment, building a life based on values I'd chosen rather than inherited. My military family began stepping in to fill the gaps my biological family had created. When my mother announced she couldn't help with the rehearsal dinner setup, 3 fellow officers volunteered immediately. When my sister suggested the reception was too casual, my commanding officer's wife offered to handle the decorations herself. These people knew me as I actually was, not as some disappointing version of who I should have become. They understood that my strength wasn't a character flaw to be corrected, but a quality to be valued. They saw leadership where my family saw stubbornness, independence where they saw selfishness. The contrast became impossible to ignore. At work, I was consulted on important decisions and trusted with significant responsibilities. At home, I was still the child whose choices needed constant correction. The dissonance was exhausting. 2 weeks before the wedding, my cousin called to ask if I was sure about having such a small ceremony. Wouldn't I regret not having a bigger celebration? Didn't I want something more memorable? The questions felt like attacks disguised as concern, and I found myself defending choices I'd made thoughtfully and deliberately. After hanging up, I realized something important. I'd spent so much energy trying to manage their expectations that I'd lost sight of my own happiness. The wedding had become less about celebrating my relationship with James and more about proving something to people who'd already decided I was inadequate. That evening, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called my closest friend from the Navy, someone who'd been my maid of honor since the beginning, and asked her a favor. It was unusual, possibly excessive, but it felt right in a way that nothing else had. She listened to my request without judgment, then said, "Consider it done." I didn't tell my family what I'd arranged. There seemed no point in giving them another opportunity to question my judgment or find fault with my plans. For once, I wanted to surprise them instead of being surprised by their disappointment. The morning of the wedding, I woke up feeling calm for the first time in weeks. Whatever happened next, I'd know I'd been true to myself and the people who actually supported me. That felt like victory enough. The morning of my wedding should have been filled with excitement and nervous energy. Instead, I found myself moving through the preparations with a strange sense of detachment, like I was watching someone else's life unfold. My bridesmaids bustled around the hotel room, chattering about hair and makeup and last-minute details, but their voices seemed to come from a great distance. My maid of honor, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chin, caught my eye in the mirror as the stylist worked on my hair. Sarah had been my roommate during officer training, and she could read my moods better than anyone. The concern in her expression was subtle but unmistakable. "Everything set for this afternoon?" she asked quietly, a question that carried more weight than the others could understand. I nodded, meeting her gaze steadily. "Everything's arranged." The dress fitting had gone smoothly this time, without my mother's commentary or my sister's suggestions for improvement. In fact, my family had been notably absent from the morning preparations, claiming they needed time to get ready at their own hotel. The relief I felt about their absence told me everything I needed to know about the state of our relationship. My phone buzzed with text messages from relatives I hadn't heard from in months, suddenly full of well wishes and excitement about the ceremony. The timing felt suspect, like they'd remembered at the last minute that they were supposed to care. But I responded graciously to each message, maintaining the peace I'd worked so hard to preserve. The photographer arrived to capture getting-ready shots, and I found myself grateful for her professional distance. She directed poses and adjusted lighting without offering opinions about my choices or suggestions for improvement. It was refreshing to be around someone who simply did their job without emotional investment in the outcome. An hour before the ceremony, I was fully dressed and ready. The dress felt right in a way it hadn't during the family fitting. The simple elegance suited me, reflecting the woman I'd become rather than the daughter they remembered. My reflection looked confident and happy, exactly what a bride should look like on her wedding day. Sarah helped me with my jewelry, pieces James had given me over the past 2 years of our relationship. Each had significance: the earrings from our first Christmas together, the bracelet from my promotion ceremony, the necklace he'd presented when I accepted his proposal. These weren't family heirlooms carrying generations of expectations, but tokens of a relationship built on mutual respect and genuine affection. The hotel room grew quiet as departure time approached. My other bridesmaids gathered their bouquets and headed downstairs to meet the transportation. Sarah lingered, checking details with the precision of someone accustomed to high-stakes operations. "The timeline's confirmed," she said, consulting her phone. "Everything will be in position exactly when you need it." I squeezed her hand, grateful for her friendship and her willingness to help me make this day what I needed it to be. "Thank you for understanding." She smiled, the expression carrying years of shared experiences and mutual support. That's what real family does. The drive to the church was mercifully brief. I sat alone in the back of the car, watching familiar neighborhoods pass by the window. This was the same route I'd driven countless times growing up, past the elementary school where I'd learned to read, the park where I'd played soccer, the corner store where I'd bought candy with allowance money. The geography of my childhood, unchanged but somehow different now that I was viewing it as someone preparing to build a new life elsewhere. At the church, I was escorted to a small room adjacent to the sanctuary where brides traditionally waited for their entrance. Through the thin walls, I could hear guests arriving, voices carrying across the space in familiar patterns. My relatives had distinctive laughs and speaking styles, recognizable even when I couldn't make out specific words. My mother appeared briefly to check on me, offering stilted compliments about my appearance and reminding me about the receiving line procedures we'd discussed. Her nervous energy filled the small room, and I found myself trying to calm her anxiety while managing my own emotions. Even on my wedding day, I was taking care of everyone else. She left to take her seat, and I was alone again with my thoughts. Through the door, I could hear the organist beginning the prelude music, signaling that the ceremony would start soon. My pulse quickened, but not from wedding nerves. Everything would change in the next few minutes, and there was no going back. The wedding coordinator knocked and entered, consulting her clipboard with professional efficiency. 5 minutes, she announced. Are you ready? I took a deep breath and nodded. I was ready for more than she could possibly understand. The processional music began, and my bridesmaids lined up in the hallway outside the sanctuary. Through the crack in the door, I could see the church filling with people, my military colleagues distinct in their dress uniforms among my casually dressed relatives. 2 different worlds occupying the same space, about to witness something neither group fully anticipated. As the last bridesmaid disappeared through the sanctuary doors, I moved to my position. The coordinator handed me my bouquet, adjusted my train one final time, and stepped back with satisfaction. You look beautiful, she said, and I believed her. The familiar chords of the bridal march began, and the coordinator reached for the door handle. This was it, the moment when everything I'd planned would either succeed spectacularly or fail in front of everyone who mattered to me. But as I prepared to step forward, I heard something that stopped me cold. Voices from inside the sanctuary, carrying clearly through the momentary silence between musical phrases. My cousin's voice, distinctive and cruel, she's a joke. Another relative chimed in, and I heard my sister laugh. Look at that dress. Embarrassing. The words hit me like physical blows. Here, at the threshold of what should have been the happiest moment of my life, they were still tearing me down. Still treating me like the inadequate child who couldn't do anything right. Still refusing to see the woman I'd become or respect the choices I'd made. For a moment, I stood frozen in the doorway, bouquet trembling in my hands. The wedding coordinator looked at me with concern, probably wondering if I was having last-minute doubts about the marriage itself. But my hesitation had nothing to do with James or our future together. It had everything to do with the people I was about to walk toward, people who couldn't manage basic kindness even on my wedding day. The organ music continued, expectant and beautiful, while I wrestled with a decision I hadn't expected to face. I could proceed as planned, walk down that aisle to my future while pretending I hadn't heard their mockery. Or I could do something that would change everything. Sarah appeared beside me, somehow sensing the crisis without being told what had happened. She saw my expression and understood immediately that something was wrong. Now, she whispered, and I knew she was asking about our arrangement. I looked through the doorway at the sanctuary full of people, at my family sitting in the front rows still chuckling about my appearance, at James waiting at the altar with a smile that would devastate him if he knew what I'd just endured. Then I nodded. The first few years after college, I convinced myself that distance would help. I was stationed across the country, building a career that demanded everything I had to give, surrounded by people who valued competence and reliability. But every phone call home reminded me that nothing fundamental had changed. I was still the daughter who disappointed them by existing differently than they'd hoped. Military life suited me in ways civilian life never had. Clear hierarchies, defined expectations, measurable results. It was a world where effort translated directly into recognition. My commanding officers evaluated my performance based on what I accomplished, not on whether I met some undefined standard of acceptability they carried in their heads. But the contrast made family gatherings increasingly difficult to navigate. I'd return home for holidays carrying confidence earned through months of challenging assignments, only to feel it drain away during the first dinner conversation. My mother would ask about my work with the same tone she might use to inquire about a hobby she found mildly puzzling. My siblings would share their own achievements while treating mine as interesting footnotes to more important family news. The pattern became predictable. I'd arrive hopeful that things might be different this time, spend a few days remembering why I'd needed distance in the first place, then leave feeling guilty for not trying harder to bridge gaps that seemed to widen with each visit. The emotional whiplash was exhausting. When I got promoted to lieutenant commander, I called home excited to share the news. My mother's response was polite congratulations followed immediately by questions about when I might consider transitioning to civilian work. My sister asked if the promotion meant more paperwork. My father wondered if higher rank would make it harder to find time for family visits. None of them asked what the promotion meant to me professionally or personally. None inquired about the increased responsibilities or the trust it represented from my superiors. They seemed to view my military career as an extended phase I'd eventually outgrow, like a hobby that had gotten out of hand. The disconnect became particularly sharp during my last assignment before meeting James. I was leading a team of 12 officers through a complex training exercise that would determine our unit's readiness for deployment. The responsibility was significant, the timeline demanding, and the standards unforgiving. For 6 months, I poured everything into ensuring my team's success. We exceeded every benchmark. Our unit received commendations for performance that set new standards for the program. My commanding officer recommended me for advanced leadership training based on results that spoke for themselves. It was the kind of professional achievement that validated years of dedicated work. When I called home to share the news, my mother listened politely and then asked if I'd had time to think about her suggestion that I consider graduate school in something more practical. The conversation lasted 12 minutes, with most of that time spent on my sister's latest work drama and my brother's new girlfriend. I hung up feeling hollow in a way that was becoming familiar. The people who should have celebrated my successes seemed determined to minimize them. The achievements that meant most to me registered as barely noteworthy in their world. It was like we were speaking different languages, with no translator available to bridge the gap. Meeting James changed something fundamental in how I understood relationships. He saw my strengths as strengths, not character flaws that needed management. When I talked about work challenges, he listened with the interest of someone who understood that my professional life mattered. When I shared successes, he celebrated them without immediately pivoting to other topics. The first time he came home with me, I watched him navigate my family dynamics with growing fascination. He answered their questions about his background and career without defensiveness. He complimented my mother's cooking without seeming to try too hard. He included my father in conversations about topics they both found interesting. But I also watched him notice things I'd stopped seeing clearly. The way conversations shifted when I spoke. The subtle eye rolls when I shared opinions that differed from the family consensus. The way my accomplishments were acknowledged briefly and then forgotten while my siblings were discussed at length. During the drive back to base, he was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "They don't see you." I asked what he meant, though I suspected I knew. They see some version of you that doesn't exist. The you they think you should be, or the you they remember from when you were younger. But they don't see who you actually are right now. His observation stung because it felt accurate. Somewhere along the way, my family had decided who I was and refused to update their understanding as I grew and changed. They related to a memory of me rather than the reality of me, and no amount of evidence seemed capable of shifting their perspective. This realization should have been liberating, but instead it felt like grief. I was mourning the family relationships I'd always hoped we might have, the acceptance and recognition that would apparently never materialize in the forms I needed. It was like losing something I'd never actually possessed, but had spent years trying to earn. The engagement represented my attempt to try once more. Perhaps a wedding would be different. Perhaps the significance of the occasion would inspire them to see me clearly, to celebrate rather than critique, to participate in my happiness rather than finding fault with my choices. Instead, every wedding-related conversation became another opportunity for them to express disappointment with decisions I'd made carefully and thoughtfully. The venue was wrong. The date was inconvenient. The guest list didn't reflect proper priorities. Each criticism felt like evidence that even this milestone wouldn't be enough to shift how they saw me. The dress fitting had been the final straw. Standing there while they dissected my appearance, listening to them treat my wedding day as their opportunity to voice every reservation they'd harbored about my taste and judgment, it crystallized something I'd been avoiding for years. They didn't want me to succeed on my own terms. They wanted me to succeed according to their definitions of success, in ways that made sense within their worldview. My achievements in areas they didn't understand or value simply didn't count in their calculation of my worth. That night in my hotel room, crying to James over the phone, I finally said out loud what I'd been thinking for months. They're not going to change. He was quiet for a moment before responding. No, they're probably not. But that doesn't mean you have to keep trying to make them happy at your own expense. His words gave me permission to stop performing the role of grateful daughter who absorbed criticism without complaint. I could love my family while also protecting myself from their inability to love me as I actually was. I could maintain relationships with them without sacrificing my self-worth to their expectations. The wedding would be my line in the sand. After years of accommodating their disapproval and managing their disappointment, I was going to do something just for me. Something that reflected my values and honored the people who actually supported me. Something that would make it impossible for them to continue treating me like the inadequate child they seemed determined to see. I called Sarah that night and made a request that surprised even me with its audacity. But it felt right in a way that nothing else had for months. For once, I was going to stop apologizing for who I'd become and start celebrating it instead. The arrangements took 2 weeks to finalize, but Sarah handled everything with military precision. The timing would be perfect, the impact undeniable, and the message crystal clear. I was done seeking approval from people who were determined to withhold it. Standing outside those sanctuary doors, listening to my cousin's cruel laughter, I felt something click into place. This was exactly why I'd made those arrangements. This was exactly what they needed to understand about the woman I'd become and the respect I'd earned in the world beyond their judgment. Sarah appeared beside me, reading my expression with the accuracy of someone who'd been through combat beside me. Now, she whispered. I looked toward the altar where James waited, trusting me to handle whatever came next with the same competence I brought to everything else in my life. I looked toward the pews where my military family sat in dress uniform, ready to honor something my biological family couldn't understand. Then I nodded, and everything changed. The organ music cut off abruptly, the sudden silence creating a vacuum that seemed to pull all the air from the sanctuary. I heard confused murmurs from the congregation, people turning in their seats to understand why the processional had stopped. Through the crack in the door, I could see my family looking puzzled, probably wondering if I'd lost my nerve at the last moment. Then the church doors at the back of the sanctuary opened wide. The sound started as a whisper of movement, fabric rustling and footsteps in perfect synchronization. Then it built into something unmistakable, the measured cadence of military personnel moving in formation. I couldn't see what was happening from my position, but I could hear it, the precise rhythm of highly trained individuals executing a maneuver with flawless coordination. The murmurs from the congregation shifted from confusion to awe. Someone gasped audibly. I heard my mother's voice, sharp with surprise, asking my father what was happening. His response was lost in the growing sound of synchronized movement. Through the crack in the door, I watched my guests turning in their seats, craning their necks to see what was unfolding behind them. The expressions on their faces shifted from puzzlement to astonishment as they processed what they were witnessing. 100 Navy SEALs entered the sanctuary in perfect formation, their dress uniforms pristine, their bearing unmistakable. Men and women I'd served with, trained with, trusted with my life during operations that would never make headlines. They moved with the fluid precision that marked them as elite, filling the aisles with a presence that transformed the entire atmosphere of the church. The sound of their movement was hypnotic. No wasted motion, no individual variation, just the collective power of people who understood exactly what they were doing and why. They lined the aisle in 2 perfect rows, creating a corridor of honor that stretched from the back of the church to the altar where James waited. As the last SEAL moved into position, a voice rang out with authority that silenced every whisper in the sanctuary. Admiral on deck. The words hit the congregation like a physical force. Every person in military dress uniform snapped to attention instantly, their movements sharp and immediate. The civilians sat frozen, suddenly understanding that something significant was happening, something that demanded respect they weren't sure how to give. My family's section fell completely silent. The laughter that had been echoing through the sanctuary moments before died, as if someone had cut the sound entirely. I could see my cousin's face through the crack in the door, her expression shifting from amusement to confusion to something approaching fear. This was the moment I'd imagined, but hadn't quite believed would feel so powerful. The contrast was stark and intentional. On one side, people who'd spent years diminishing my achievements and questioning my worth. On the other, warriors who'd earned the right to call me their equal and their leader. The wedding coordinator looked at me with wide eyes, clearly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was unfolding. This was probably beyond anything in her professional experience, certainly not covered in any bridal planning guide. But she recovered quickly, recognizing that whatever was happening according to plan. "Are you ready?" she whispered, though her tone suggested she wasn't sure anyone could be ready for something like this. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. The door opened fully, and I was visible to the congregation for the first time. The effect was immediate and electric. The seals maintained their formation, but I could feel their collective attention focusing on me. These were people who'd seen me lead in crisis situations, who'd trusted my judgment when lives hung in the balance, who'd watched me earn my rank through decisions that mattered. The silence in the sanctuary was absolute now. Even the usual sounds of a large gathering, shuffling feet, cleared throats, rustling programs, had disappeared completely. Every eye was on me, but more than that, every eye was seeing me clearly for perhaps the first time. I began walking down the aisle, my steps measured and confident. This wasn't the nervous bride of romantic comedies, worried about tripping or forgetting her lines. This was an officer moving through a formation of her peers, acknowledged and respected by people who understood what leadership actually meant. As I passed each row of SEALs, I could see familiar faces maintaining their perfect military bearing, while their eyes conveyed pride and support. These were relationships built on mutual respect, tested under pressure, proven through shared challenges. They'd arranged their schedules, traveled from various assignments, and appeared in full dress uniform because they believed I was worth honoring. The contrast with my family's section was impossible to ignore. Where my relatives sat in stunned silence, clearly uncertain how to process what they were witnessing, my military colleagues radiated confidence and purpose. They weren't here out of obligation or family duty. They were here because they chose to be, because they valued who I was and what I'd accomplished. Halfway down the aisle, I caught sight of my mother's face. Her expression was complex, confusion, certainly, but also something that might have been recognition dawning. For the first time, she was seeing me surrounded by people who treated me as someone important, someone worth celebrating, someone whose achievements commanded respect. My cousin, the one who'd called me a joke minutes earlier, looked like she was trying to solve a puzzle she couldn't quite grasp. The woman she'd been mocking was clearly someone these impressive people considered worth honoring. The disconnect between her perception and reality was finally becoming visible to her. I continued walking, drawing closer to James with each step. He stood at the altar watching me approach, his own military bearing evident in his posture and expression. This was a man who understood exactly what the formation around me represented, who knew what it meant that these people had chosen to honor me in this way. The SEALs maintained their positions as I passed between their ranks, creating a corridor of respect that felt like walking through history itself. This was what recognition looked like when it came from people who understood your actual worth. This was what celebration felt like when it wasn't qualified by criticism or diminished by subtle disapproval. As I approached the altar, I realized that everything had changed in the space of 5 minutes. My family had seen me as they never had before, not as the disappointing daughter who couldn't quite meet their expectations, but as the accomplished leader who'd earned the respect of some of the military's finest personnel. The transformation wasn't just in how they saw me, though that was part of it. The transformation was in how clearly I could now see the difference between people who supported me and people who didn't, between relationships based on respect and relationships based on habit, between the family I'd been born into and the family I'd chosen to build. James reached for my hand as I joined him at the altar, his smile conveying understanding and pride in equal measure. Behind us, 100 Navy SEALs remained at attention, a living testament to the worth I'd never needed to prove to them because they'd seen it demonstrated in action. The ceremony could proceed now, but everything had already changed. The laughter had stopped, the mockery had ended, and the respect I'd been seeking for years had finally materialized, not from the people I'd expected to give it, but from the people who actually understood its value. The wedding ceremony proceeded with a gravity and dignity that transformed it into something more than a simple exchange of vows. The presence of the seals shifted the entire atmosphere, lending weight and significance to every word spoken. When the officiant asked if anyone objected to the union, the silence wasn't just customary politeness, it was the profound quiet of people who understood they were witnessing something important. James and I exchanged rings while surrounded by this wall of military precision and personal support. The vows we'd written felt different when spoken in front of people who knew firsthand what commitment meant, what loyalty looked like when tested under fire, what promises were worth making and keeping. These weren't just pretty words about love and partnership, they were pledges witnessed by people who'd seen both of us honor our word when it mattered most. My family sat through the ceremony in continued silence, still processing what they'd witnessed. The contrast between their earlier mockery and current subdued attention was stark enough that other guests began to notice. Conversations during the cocktail hour carried undertones of curiosity about the spectacular entrance and what it meant about the bride they thought they knew. During the reception, my military colleagues were generous with stories that painted me in ways my family had never considered. Tales of leadership under pressure, decisions that had saved lives, recognition from superiors who didn't give praise lightly. My relatives listened with expressions that shifted between surprise and something that might have been dawning respect. My cousin, the one who'd called me a joke, approached me during a quiet moment between toasts. "I had no idea," she said, her voice uncertain. "About your career, I mean. The military thing always seemed so." "So what?" I asked, not helping her find a comfortable way to finish the sentence. She struggled for words. "I guess I never understood what it meant. What you actually do." I nodded, recognizing this as probably the closest thing to an apology I'd receive. "Most people don't," I said simply. "That's fine. But it doesn't mean it isn't important." The conversation was brief and incomplete, but it represented a crack in the foundation of assumptions my family had built about me. They dismissed my career because they didn't understand it, reduced my accomplishments to footnotes because they didn't fit their definition of success. The presence of 100 highly decorated military personnel had made their ignorance visible in ways that were impossible to ignore. My mother's approach was more direct. During the parent dances, she whispered, "You should have told us more about what you do. We didn't realize." "Realize what?" I asked, though I knew what she meant. "How important you are. How much people respect you." The comment was revealing in ways she probably didn't intend. My importance hadn't changed. I'd been doing the same work, earning the same recognition, demonstrating the same competence for years. What had changed was her ability to see it clearly, forced into visibility by a display she couldn't dismiss or minimize. But I also recognized the limitation of her newfound understanding. She was impressed by the external validation, the visible demonstration of respect from people she now recognized as significant. The internal qualities that had earned that respect, the leadership, the integrity, the competence under pressure, remained as invisible to her as they'd always been. Still, it was progress. For the first time in years, she was seeing me as someone worth respecting rather than someone who needed guidance and correction. The shift felt fragile and incomplete, but it was real. The evening continued with a series of toasts that celebrated different aspects of our relationship and achievements. My commanding officer spoke about leadership qualities he'd observed in both James and me. Colleagues shared stories of our professional accomplishments that clearly impressed civilian guests who'd never heard these details before. When my maid of honor stood to speak, she looked directly at my family before beginning. "Some people here tonight are just learning what those of us in the military have known for years," she said. "That they're in the presence of two exceptional officers who've dedicated their lives to service and proven themselves in ways that demand respect." Her words carried an edge that was probably lost on most guests, but unmistakable to my relatives. This was as close to a direct confrontation as military courtesy would permit, a statement that their previous treatment of me had been noted and found wanting. The dancing afterward felt different too. James and I moved together, surrounded by people who celebrated our relationship without reservation or qualification. No one questioned our compatibility or worried about the challenges of military life. These were people who understood that our shared profession was a strength rather than a complication, that our commitment to service enhanced rather than threatened our commitment to each other. As the evening wound down, several relatives made awkward attempts at conversation that felt like efforts to rebuild bridges they were just now realizing they'd damaged. My sister asked about my deployment schedule with what seemed like genuine interest. My father mentioned that he'd like to learn more about what my work actually involved. These overtures felt tentative and uncertain, like people testing whether a door they'd slammed shut might still be opened from their side. I responded politely but without enthusiasm, recognizing these efforts as reactions to what they'd witnessed rather than genuine shifts in understanding. They were impressed by the external validation, but I wasn't convinced they'd internalized the deeper lesson about respect and recognition. The most telling moment came as guests were leaving. My cousin approached one more time, this time with her husband in tow. "We were wondering," she said hesitantly, "if you could tell us more about how someone gets into the SEALs? Our son is thinking about military service and after tonight." The request was loaded with assumptions I didn't bother to correct. She still didn't understand the distinctions between different military branches and roles, still couldn't grasp the complexity of the career path I'd chosen. But she now recognized that military service could lead to something impressive, something worth respecting. Her son's hypothetical interest was really her way of acknowledging that she'd been wrong about the value of what I did. I gave her some basic information and suggested resources for her son to explore if he was seriously interested. But I also recognized this conversation as evidence of how shallow their previous understanding had been. They dismissed my career without bothering to learn what it actually involved, reduced years of dedicated service to a phase I'd hopefully outgrow. James and I drove back to our hotel in comfortable silence, both processing the evening's events. "Finally," he said, "that was more dramatic than anything we'd discussed." I laughed, feeling lighter than I had in months. "Sarah doesn't do anything halfway. How do you feel about it?" About how they reacted? The question deserved a thoughtful answer. How did I feel about watching my family's understanding of me shift in real time? About seeing their dismissive attitude crumble under the weight of undeniable evidence? About forcing them to confront their own ignorance through a display they couldn't minimize or ignore? "Satisfied," I said finally. Not because I wanted to humiliate them, but because I needed them to see clearly. For once, they couldn't dismiss what I'd accomplished or pretend it didn't matter. The satisfaction wasn't about revenge, though I understood why it might look that way to outside observers. It was about clarity, forcing a moment of truth that had been avoided for too long. My family had spent years relating to a version of me that didn't exist, refusing to update their understanding as I grew and achieved. The ceremony had made that willful blindness impossible to maintain. In the days following the wedding, I received a series of texts and calls from relatives who'd been present. Some were apologetic, acknowledging that they'd misjudged my career and accomplishments. Others were curious, asking questions about military life they'd never bothered to pose before. A few were defensive, suggesting that I could have explained things better if I'd wanted them to understand. The range of responses told me everything I needed to know about which relationships might be salvaged and which had probably run their course. People who could acknowledge their mistake and express genuine interest in learning more were worth continued effort. Those who blamed me for their ignorance or suggested that their dismissive treatment had been somehow justified were revealing attitudes that wouldn't change regardless of how much evidence they encountered. My mother called 3 days after the wedding, her voice carrying an uncertainty I rarely heard from her. "I've been thinking about what happened," she said. "About the ceremony and the people who came to honor you." I waited, curious what conclusion she'd reached. "I realize we haven't been very supportive," she continued. "Of your career, I mean. We didn't understand how important it was, how much you'd accomplished." The admission was significant, probably the closest thing to an apology I'd received from her. But it also revealed the limitation of her newfound understanding. She was sorry for not recognizing my importance, but she didn't seem to grasp that importance shouldn't have been a prerequisite for basic respect and support. "I'd like to do better," she added. "If you're willing to help us understand." The request was reasonable, even touching in its way. But I also recognized it as placing responsibility on me to fix relationships that had been damaged by their unwillingness to see me clearly. They wanted me to educate them about why I deserved better treatment, rather than acknowledging that better treatment should have been the baseline all along. Still, it was a starting point. "I'm willing to try," I told her. "But things need to be different going forward." We talked for another 20 minutes about what that might look like. Fewer criticisms disguised as helpful suggestions. More genuine interest in my work and achievements. Acknowledgement that my choices were valid even when they didn't align with their preferences or expectations. The conversation felt fragile but genuine, like the first careful steps on ice that might or might not hold our weight. Change would be gradual and probably incomplete, but at least the possibility existed now where it hadn't before. Similar conversations happened with other family members over the following weeks. My sister admitted that she'd never really listened when I talked about work, assuming it was just job talk that didn't matter much. My father acknowledged that he'd been uncomfortable with my military career because he didn't understand it, and discomfort had translated into dismissiveness. These admissions were valuable, but they also highlighted how much damage had been done through years of benign neglect and casual dismissal. Trust, once broken, required time and consistent effort to rebuild. Good intentions weren't enough. I needed to see sustained changes in behavior before I could believe the relationships had fundamentally shifted. Some relatives made genuine efforts to bridge the gap their previous attitudes had created. They asked thoughtful questions about my work, remembered details from previous conversations, and made space for my experiences in family discussions. These gestures were small but meaningful, evidence that people could change when they chose to make the effort. Others seemed to believe that acknowledging their mistake was sufficient, that admitting they'd been wrong somehow reset the relationship to a clean slate. They were surprised when I remained cautious, when I didn't immediately return to the accommodating role I'd played for years. They wanted forgiveness without having to earn it, understanding without having to demonstrate it. The wedding had been a line in the sand, but the real work of rebuilding relationships happened in the months that followed. Some family members proved willing to do that work, accepting that changed dynamics were the price of their previous dismissiveness. Others gradually drifted away, apparently deciding that relating to me as an equal required more effort than they were willing to invest. James watched this process unfold with the patience of someone who'd seen family dynamics shift under pressure before. He offered support when I needed it, but didn't try to influence my decisions about which relationships to prioritize. He understood that I was learning to set boundaries I should have established years earlier, even when that process was painful. 6 months after the wedding, the new normal had largely established itself. I had closer relationships with family members who'd proven willing to see me clearly and respect my choices. I had distant but civil relationships with those who'd made minimal effort to change. And I had no relationship at all with a few relatives who'd decided that acknowledging my worth was somehow beneath them. The shift felt liberating in ways I hadn't anticipated. Energy I'd spent managing their disappointment was now available for relationships that actually nourished me. Time I devoted to seeking approval from people determined to withhold it could be invested in people who appreciated what I brought to their lives. Looking back, I realized that the wedding ceremony had been less about revenge than about revelation. My family needed to see clearly what they'd been missing, and I needed to see clearly which relationships were worth preserving. The presence of 100 Navy SEALs had forced both recognitions simultaneously, creating a moment of truth that years of gradual conversation probably couldn't have achieved. The lesson wasn't that dramatic gestures solve relationship problems. They don't. The lesson was that sometimes people need undeniable evidence before they'll acknowledge truths they've been avoiding. And sometimes you need to stop seeking approval from people who are determined not to give it, choosing instead to build your life around people who see your worth clearly from the beginning. 2 years later, James and I were preparing for our first major deployment together, a 6-month assignment that would test our relationship in ways civilian couples never experience. As we finalized arrangements and said temporary goodbyes, I was struck by how different my family's response was compared to their earlier dismissiveness of my career. My mother called regularly in the weeks leading up to deployment, asking practical questions about communication schedules and expressing concerns that felt genuinely caring rather than critically judgmental. My sister offered to help coordinate family updates while we were overseas, recognizing that maintaining connections would require effort from people at home. Even my cousin, the one who'd called me a joke, sent a care package with a note saying she was proud of my service. The transformation wasn't complete. They still didn't fully understand the complexities of military life or the significance of the work we'd be doing. But they'd moved from dismissive ignorance to respectful support, acknowledging that our careers mattered even when they couldn't grasp all the details. More importantly, I'd learned to value their support without needing it for validation. The approval I'd sought for years had finally materialized, but by then I'd built my sense of worth on foundations that didn't require their recognition. Their changed attitude was pleasant but not essential, a bonus rather than a necessity. The deployment itself went smoothly, with both James and I performing duties that drew commendations from our superiors. We returned home to family members who asked informed questions about our experiences and expressed genuine pride in our accomplishments. The contrast with their previous indifference was stark enough to remind me how far we'd all traveled from that wedding day confrontation. During our homecoming dinner, my father raised a toast that surprised everyone present. To my daughter and son-in-law, he said, who've shown us what dedication and excellence look like, and who've been patient enough to help us learn to recognize those qualities when we see them. The words were simple, but they represented acknowledgement I'd been seeking for decades. Not just recognition of my professional achievements, but understanding that their previous inability to see those achievements clearly had been a failing on their part rather than mine. After dinner, as we were clearing dishes, my mother pulled me aside for a private conversation. "I want you to know," she said, "that your wedding day was a turning point for me. Not just seeing all those people honor you, but realizing how wrong I'd been about what you'd accomplished." She paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I spent years trying to make you into someone you weren't, instead of appreciating who you actually were. I'm sorry it took such a dramatic moment for me to see clearly." The apology was more complete than anything I'd expected to receive, acknowledging not just the mistake, but the pattern of behavior that had created years of tension between us. It wasn't enough to erase the damage that had been done, but it was sufficient to build something new on. "I appreciate that," I told her. "And I appreciate the effort you've made since then to understand my life better." We hugged, and I felt something settle that had been unsettled for a very long time. The relationship would never be what it might have been if she'd seen me clearly from the beginning, but it could be something genuinely good moving forward. Later that evening, as James and I drove back to our quarters, I reflected on the journey from that wedding day confrontation to this moment of genuine family connection. The change hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy for anyone involved. But it had been possible, which was more than I'd believed for many years. "Any regrets about the SEAL entrance?" James asked, reading my contemplative mood accurately. I considered the question seriously. The dramatic gesture had forced revelations that might never have occurred naturally. It had created embarrassment and discomfort for people I loved, even when they deserved those feelings. It had drawn a line in relationships that some people hadn't been able or willing to cross. But it had also stopped a pattern of dismissal and disrespect that had been damaging us all for years. It had forced conversations that needed to happen and acknowledgments that were long overdue. It had created space for relationships based on who I actually was rather than who they thought I should become. "No regrets," I said finally. It was exactly what needed to happen. The wedding had been a beginning rather than an ending, the start of a process of rebuilding relationships on foundations of mutual respect rather than familial obligation. Some of those relationships had thrived under the new conditions. Others had withered when respect proved too challenging to sustain. But all of them were now honest in ways they'd never been before. That honesty had been worth fighting for, even when the fight required calling in 100 Navy SEALs to make my point impossible to ignore. Sometimes the truth needs dramatic presentation before people are willing to see it clearly. Sometimes respect has to be demanded before it will be freely given. And sometimes the family you're born into needs proof that you've earned the family you've chosen before they'll treat you like you belong to both. The woman who'd stood frozen outside that sanctuary door, listening to cruel laughter from people who should have supported her, felt like someone I'd known long ago. In her place stood someone who understood her own worth, demanded appropriate treatment, and built her life around people who saw her value clearly from the beginning. That transformation had begun with 100 Navy SEALs lining a church aisle, but it had been completed through 2 years of careful relationship rebuilding and boundary setting. The dramatic moment had created the possibility for change, but the daily work of sustained respect had made that change permanent. Looking toward the future, I felt optimistic about family relationships that had been redefined by crisis and strengthened by mutual effort. The people who'd chosen to do the hard work of seeing me clearly had been rewarded with genuine connection. Those who hadn't made that choice had been given the space they apparently needed to maintain their comfortable misconceptions. Either way, I was finally free to be exactly who I'd become, a competent officer, a devoted partner, and a woman who no longer needed anyone's permission to recognize her own worth. The wedding day had been about demanding that recognition from others, but the real victory was no longer needing their approval to know I deserved it. That knowledge felt like the most valuable gift I could have given myself, the understanding that I was worthy of respect simply because I existed, not because I'd proven it to people who were determined not to see it. The SEALs lining that aisle had honored something that was already true, not something I needed them to make real. And that distinction, more than any dramatic gesture or family reconciliation, was what had truly set me free. And that's how one moment at the altar turned years of mockery into silence. For the first time, my family saw me for who I really was. Have you ever had to prove your worth to people who refused to see it? Did you ever draw a line that changed the way others treated you? Drop your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And if this hit home for you, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that respect is earned, not begged for.